The revival chamber smelled of sterile cold and something else, something organic that Marcus couldn't identify, a sweetness mixed with metal that coated the back of his throat. His body felt wrong, too light, as though gravity had loosened its grip. The medical technicians spoke a language he didn't recognize, their voices rhythmic and precise, their movements around his pod efficient and impersonal. He had closed his eyes on Earth. Boarded the generation ship with 317 other volunteers, settled into the stasis pod, with his hand pressed against the viewing panel, watching the launch bay until the chemicals pulled him under. The mission parameters had been clear. 240 years to Proxima Centauri b. He would wake to a new world, to the colony infrastructure his ship's AI would have built during the journey, to the promise of beginning again. Instead, he woke to silence, to empty corridors, to the sensation of time having passed in quantities his mind couldn't process. The revival team, creatures with elongated limbs and faces that shifted between familiar and incomprehensible, handled him with clinical detachment. They drew blood, scanned his body with instruments that hummed against his skin, spoke over him as though he couldn't hear, their tones carrying the flat certainty of documentation rather than conversation. One word repeated across their exchanges, a sound that approximated human, and he understood with a clarity that bypassed language that they were categorizing him. Specimen, artifact, thing recovered from darkness and delivered into light that had nothing to do with home. They gave him grey clothing that didn't fit properly, led him through corridors where the architecture curved in ways that made his eyes hurt. The artificial gravity felt inconsistent, stronger in some sections, weaker in others, as though the ship, station, structure, operated on principles his body hadn't evolved to navigate. Other beings passed in the corridors, creatures of varied physiologies, none of them human, none of them looking at him with anything resembling recognition or kinship. A technician with 4 arms and bioluminescent markings across their thorax gestured toward a small chamber. Marcus entered because there was nowhere else to go, because the alternative was standing motionless in a corridor among beings who regarded him with the mild interest reserved for museum exhibits. The chamber contained a sleeping platform, a hygiene unit, a viewing screen that showed star patterns he didn't recognize, no personal effects, no indication that this space belonged to anyone. He sat on the platform. The material adjusted beneath him, conforming to his body shape with disconcerting precision. Through the viewing screen, a planet turned slowly, purple and green, its cloud formations geometric rather than chaotic, beautiful, completely alien. His hands shook. He pressed them against his thighs, willing them still, but the trembling spread upward through his arms, into his chest, until his entire body was trying to expel something it couldn't name. Not fear, exactly, something larger. The physical recognition that everything he had known, everyone he had known, existed only in memory now, if it existed at all. No one had explained what happened, how long he'd been in stasis, why the ship had failed, where the others had gone. The revival team had processed him with the focused efficiency of people executing a predetermined protocol, their interactions minimal and purely functional. He was cargo that had arrived unexpectedly. Valuable cargo, perhaps, judging by the security measures and the hushed tones when certain technicians examined his genetic scan results. But cargo nonetheless. The viewing screen changed without his input, displaying what appeared to be archival footage. Earth as seen from orbit, cities at night creating webs of light across the continents. The image quality was poor, degraded, as though copied and recopied across generations. Text scrolled in a language he couldn't read, accompanied by audio in that same rhythmic, precise language the technicians spoke. He watched humanity's homeworld turn on the screen, while his hands gradually stopped shaking. The trembling didn't stop because he'd found calm. It stopped because his body had exhausted its immediate capacity for physical response, settling into a numbness that felt almost like equilibrium. When the chamber door opened again, he didn't startle. He simply stood, because that seemed to be what was expected. The Royal Observatory occupied the highest point of the palace structure, a chamber where transparent panels curved overhead to provide unobstructed views of the binary star system that dominated Viridian space. Marcus had been escorted there by guards who communicated through gesture, and firm pressure on his shoulders, guiding him through corridors that grew progressively more elaborate, walls that seemed to breathe with subtle color shifts, floors that adjusted their texture beneath his feet, air that carried scents he had no framework to interpret. They left him standing in the center of the chamber. The floor beneath him was dark and reflective, creating the illusion of infinite depth, as though he stood suspended in space itself. Above, the twin stars burned, one amber, one pale blue, their light mixing to create shadows with doubled edges. He kept his eyes on the stars. It seemed safer than examining the chamber itself, than acknowledging the observation panels set into the walls where he could sense movement, the presence of witnesses whose purposes he didn't understand. When she entered, he felt it before he saw her. A shift in air pressure, a change in temperature. Something his body registered that bypassed conscious thought. His breathing altered. The fine hairs on his arms lifted. She moved with absolute certainty, each step deliberate and controlled, her body carrying none of the hesitation or accommodation he'd seen in other beings navigating the palace's variable gravity. She was tall, taller than him by perhaps half a foot, her body structure humanoid but distinctly other. Her skin held an iridescent quality that shifted between deep green and bronze, depending on the angle of light. Geometric patterns marked her shoulders and arms. What he initially took for tattoos but realized were natural features, armor plating that lay flush with softer tissue. Her face was angular, beautiful in a way that registered despite the profound differences. Her eyes larger than human proportions, pupilless, entirely black. She circled him slowly. He held still, his training from some distant life asserting itself. When observed, give them nothing, show no weakness, maintain composure, but his body betrayed him anyway. His pulse accelerated. His breathing grew shallow. When she moved behind him, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her body, his shoulders tensed involuntarily. When she leaned closer, he felt her breath disturb his hair, and something in his hindbrain screamed danger, even as another part of him responded to the proximity with confused attention. She completed her circuit and stood facing him. For 3 seconds, he met her eyes. They reflected no light, those black expanses, but something in them carried weight, calculation perhaps, or recognition. Then instinct made him look away, training or self-preservation, or the weight of knowing absolutely nothing about his circumstances, except that she held power here and he held none. She spoke, her voice lower than he'd expected, each word carefully shaped, as though language required physical effort. The sounds made no sense, but the tone was clear enough. Command. Question. Something that required response. He said nothing, had nothing to say that would matter. After a moment she turned and left, her footsteps precise against the reflective floor, and he was alone again with the doubled shadows and the watching panels and the knowledge that some evaluation had just occurred, though he had no idea what had been measured or what the results might mean. The chambers they gave him connected to hers through a single door, unsealed, always open. Marcus discovered this the first night, waking from shallow sleep to find the door simply absent where he expected privacy. Beyond it, he could see into another room, larger, more elaborate, dominated by a sleeping platform that seemed to float above the floor without visible support, empty at that moment but her space, her territory. He stood in his own doorway for several minutes, testing the boundaries. No barrier appeared, no alarm sounded. The opening remained, an architectural statement about his status here, guest or prisoner or something for which his language had no adequate term. During the day he rarely saw her. Guards brought him food, strange textures, unfamiliar flavors that his body accepted with surprising ease, suggesting the revival team had made adjustments to his physiology he hadn't consented to. He was escorted to a medical facility where technicians performed scans and tests, their instruments cool against his skin, their manner briskly professional. He was given access to a physical training room where he could maintain muscle tone, run patterns on a treadmill that adjusted its speed and incline seemingly at random, testing him or gathering data or both. But at night, he heard her, the rustle of fabric, the small clicks her respiratory system made during rest, the sound of her moving through her chamber, her footsteps creating subtle vibrations he could feel through the floor. He began mapping her rhythms. She retired late by his estimation, often hours after he'd settled onto his own sleeping platform. Her rest cycle seemed shorter than his, or perhaps she simply required less sleep. Sometimes he woke to find her already moving through her chamber, her silhouette visible through the doorway, backlit by the faint bioluminescence her skin produced in darkness. She never closed the door, never even acknowledged that privacy might be expected or desired. The opening remained constant, a bridge between their spaces that he couldn't cross. Some invisible boundary prevented him from entering her chamber without permission, but through which every sound, every small movement, every evidence of her physical existence traveled freely into his awareness. It should have felt invasive, should have triggered the resentment he'd been carefully containing since revival, the anger at having no control over his circumstances, no say in what happened to his body or his future. Instead, he found himself listening, timing his own breathing to the rhythms of hers, waking at odd hours and lying still, tracking her location by sound alone, his body attuned to her presence in ways that felt instinctive rather than chosen. On the 7th night, he woke to find her standing in the doorway. She didn't enter, simply stood there, her form outlined in the faint light from the stars visible through her chamber's viewing panels. He could see the rise and fall of her breathing, the subtle shift of her weight from one foot to the other, the luminescence patterns across her skin, pulsing in slow, regular intervals. He sat up slowly, kept his movements small, unthreatening, met her eyes across the distance and saw nothing he could interpret. Calculation, curiosity, assessment, or something else entirely. They remained like that for perhaps 2 minutes. No words, no gestures, just the space between them and the recognition that she could close it any time she chose while he could not. Then she turned and moved back into her chamber, and he lay down again, his heart rate elevated, his skin warm, his body responding to the encounter in ways that bypassed rational thought. He didn't sleep again that night. The ceremonial bathing chamber existed outside normal palace geography. To reach it, Marcus and the Queen, he'd learned her designation was Lyraseth from overheard conversations, though no one addressed her directly in his presence, walked through corridors that seemed to fold space, distance contracting unnaturally, his sense of direction failing completely. The chamber itself was circular, its walls constructed from dark stone, shot through with veins of luminescent material that pulsed in time with Lyraseth's bioluminescence. Water filled the center depression, its surface perfectly still, its temperature precisely regulated to a warmth that made his muscles loosen involuntarily when they descended the steps. A physician stood near the wall, one of the 4-armed beings who had attended his revival. They spoke to Lyraseth in that rhythmic language, their tone clinical, and she responded briefly before the physician withdrew to an observation station behind a semi-transparent panel. Lyraseth moved through the water with natural ease, the liquid reaching mid-torso on her frame. She positioned herself across from him, perhaps 6 feet of space between them, and extended her hand palm up. Invitation or instruction, he couldn't distinguish. He stepped forward. The water resistance made his movements slow, dreamlike. When he was within arm's reach, she gestured for him to turn. He complied, felt her hands settle on his shoulders. The touch was careful, exploratory. Her fingers traced the lines of his shoulder blades, the column of his spine, the muscles along his ribs. His skin responded immediately, temperature rising, awareness sharpening to focus entirely on the points of contact. Her hands were warmer than human normal, her skin texture different, the armor plating smooth and hard, while the softer tissue between held surprising delicacy. She worked systematically, mapping his upper back, his sides, the base of his neck. Each area received the same careful attention, her fingertips pressing lightly, feeling for responses he didn't consciously control. The small jump of muscle, the shift in breathing, the involuntary lean into pressure. When she gestured for him to turn again, he moved slowly, his body hyper-aware of the water's resistance, of the minimal distance between them, of the clinical observer behind the panel documenting every response. Face to face now. Her eyes were entirely black still, but the armor plating on her shoulders and chest had shifted color, deeper bronze with threads of gold. Her bioluminescence patterns pulsed faster. She raised her hand to his chest, traced the muscle definition there, the ridges of his ribs, the sternum. Her touch remained clinical, but his body didn't distinguish between clinical and intimate. His breathing deepened. His heart rate accelerated. When her palm settled flat over his sternum, he felt his own pulse hammering against her touch. She held position for perhaps 30 seconds, then withdrew and gestured expectation. His turn. His hands shook when he raised them. She remained motionless, waiting, her body carrying no tension or apprehension. He placed his fingertips against her shoulders, where human clavicles would be. The armor plating was smooth, almost glass-like, radiating heat. He followed its geometric patterns downward, finding where it gave way to softer tissue along her upper arms. She made a sound, low, resonant, not quite a hum. He froze, uncertain if he'd caused discomfort, but she didn't pull away. After a moment, he continued, his hands gaining minimal confidence as he traced the natural lines of her body structure. The armor plating formed intricate patterns that his fingertips learned, hexagonal shapes that interlocked perfectly, edges that rose slightly above the softer tissue, creating topography his hands navigated with increasing attention. Her breathing changed. Slowed or deepened, he couldn't determine which. The bioluminescence patterns across her shoulders brightened, colors shifting toward warmer tones. His hands found the base of her spine where the armor plating became denser, protective. He pressed lightly, and her entire body shifted, not pulling away, but pressing into the contact, fractionally. The observer made a notation sound, clinical documentation of physiological response, the reminder that this was protocol, not intimacy, that their bodies were being monitored, measured, catalogued. But his hands remained on her skin, and hers rose to mirror his position, settling on his waist just above the waterline. The touch was warm and steady, and created a circuit between them, their hands on each other's bodies, the water surrounding them, the space that had once felt vast contracting to just this, the mapping of unfamiliar surfaces, the exchange of heat and pressure, and some information his conscious mind couldn't process, but his body clearly understood. The contact sessions became nightly, always in the bathing chamber, always observed, always following the same essential structure. She would touch him first, then he would reciprocate, their exploration gradually expanding from shoulders and back to arms, sides, the careful navigation of boundaries both biological and unspoken. But between those formal sessions, other patterns emerged. Marcus found her in the training facility one morning. She moved through a routine that looked like combat practice, her body executing strikes and blocks against projected targets, her movements fluid and controlled. He stood in the doorway, uncertain if his presence was permitted, but she glanced toward him briefly and then continued without pause. After several minutes, she stopped and gestured him forward, positioned him in front of a target projection, and demonstrated a basic strike sequence. Her hands on his arms correcting his form, her body heat radiating as she moved around him, adjusting his stance. She didn't speak, never spoke during these interactions outside the formal sessions, but her corrections were clear. Too much tension in his shoulders, not enough rotation in his hips, his balance wrong for the strike pattern. He followed her guidance, his body responding to the physical instruction more effectively than words would have managed. When he executed the sequence correctly, she made that low, resonant sound again. Approval, perhaps, or acknowledgement. They trained together after that. Not every day, but often enough that his body began anticipating the sessions, waking earlier than necessary, moving through his own chamber with restless energy until the guards came to escort him. She was faster than him, stronger in ways that had nothing to do with muscle mass. When they sparred, light contact only, more about timing and technique than force, she controlled the engagement completely. But she also taught, demonstrated variations, waited while he processed the movements and attempted replication. Sometimes between rounds they would sit against the training room wall, their breathing elevated, their bodies heated from exertion. She would extend her water container toward him, offering, sharing. He would accept and drink, tasting something sweeter than water, returning it so she could do the same. Small rituals, tiny exchanges that accumulated into something resembling routine. The contact sessions at night remained formal, clinical, documented. But these morning trainings existed outside that structure, unobserved and unmarked by protocol. In his chamber at night, he could hear her through the open doorway. the clicking of her respiratory system, the rustle of fabric. Sometimes sounds that suggested frustration or discomfort, small shifts in breathing, restless movement that continued for extended periods before settling. He wondered if she could hear him equally well, if she tracked his sleeplessness, his own restless movements, the nights when the weight of his isolation became physical and he sat by his viewing screen watching stars he didn't recognize, mourning things he couldn't change. One night, he woke to find her in his doorway again. Standing motionless, her bioluminescence patterns dim, her breathing slow and even, possibly asleep, he realized. Sleepwalking or the Viridian equivalent, her body moving unconsciously toward his location. He sat up carefully, spoke her name softly, uncertain if it would register. Her eyes opened. Had they been closed? He couldn't tell with those black expanses, but something in her posture shifted, awareness returning. She looked at him, then at her own position in the doorway, and made a sound he couldn't interpret. Then she turned and moved back into her chamber, and he heard her settle onto her sleeping platform, the clicks of her respiratory system resuming their regular pattern. He didn't mention it the next morning during training, neither did she, but something had shifted. The boundary between protocol and something else, between the formal exchanges observed by physicians and the small accumulated moments that no one documented or measured. The palace contained an interior garden, a biodome where plants from multiple worlds grew in carefully regulated sectors. Lyraseth brought Marcus there on what he'd calculated as roughly his 30th day since revival, though time remained slippery, measured more by routine than chronological certainty. The air held more moisture here, warmer than the corridors, carrying scents that almost approached familiar. Not earth flora, but close enough that his body relaxed fractionally, some deep recognition firing that this environment supported life in ways compatible with his existence. Lyraseth moved along the pathways without apparent destination. Marcus followed, maintaining the respectful distance protocol seemed to require in public spaces, though her body language suggested no concern about his proximity. She stopped beside a plant with spiral-patterned leaves, their surfaces shifting through subtle color variations, green to blue to violet, cycling continuously. She touched one leaf carefully, and it responded by brightening, the colors intensifying briefly before settling back to baseline. She glanced at him, then gestured toward another plant nearby, invitation or instruction. He approached carefully, extended his hand, mimicked her gentle touch. The plant responded differently to him, its colors shifting toward warmer tones, gold and amber, before returning to neutral. Lyraseth made her approval sound. Then she moved to another section of the garden, and he followed. They spent over an hour there, moving between plant varieties, Lyraseth occasionally demonstrating some interaction, how certain flowers opened to specific touch patterns, how others responded to breath or body heat. Marcus learned by observation and replication, his hands becoming more confident with each interaction. At one point, she led him to a small clearing where bench-like structures curved from the ground itself, grown rather than constructed. She sat, and after a moment's hesitation, he sat beside her. Not touching, but closer than they'd been outside the formal contact sessions. The garden sounds surrounded them, water moving through unseen channels, the rustle of leaves responding to filtered air currents, small creatures chirping or clicking from hidden locations, almost peaceful, almost resembling something unthreatening. Lyraseth's bioluminescence patterns were bright in the garden's softer light. Marcus found himself watching them, tracking the rhythms, noticing how certain patterns seemed connected to her breathing, while others fluctuated independently, perhaps emotional states, perhaps physiological processes he had no framework to interpret. She turned her head toward him. Their faces were perhaps 18 inches apart, close enough that he could see details in her features he'd missed during the clinical evaluations. Small scars along her jawline where armor plating had been damaged and regrown imperfectly, variations in the iridescence of her skin that created subtle patterns beyond the obvious armor plating. The way her eyes reflected nothing but somehow conveyed attention. His hand moved without conscious decision, rising toward her face, stopping before contact, requesting permission or offering possibility. She didn't pull away, didn't make any sound or gesture of refusal, simply waited, her breathing steady, her luminescence patterns brightening slightly. He closed the distance, let his fingertips brush against her cheek, where armor plating gave way to softer tissue. The texture was unexpected, neither human soft nor armor hard, something between, with a warmth that immediately spread up through his fingers, into his palm. She inhaled sharply. Not distress, he thought. Something else. Her eyes remained fixed on his. He traced the line of her jaw carefully, feeling where biological systems he didn't understand worked beneath her skin. Small movements, pulses, the physical evidence of alien physiology functioning in real time beneath his touch. Her hand rose, settled on his chest, palm flat, directly over his heart. Feeling its accelerated rhythm, the heat radiating through his skin, his body's involuntary response to proximity and touch, and the accumulated weight of 30 nights sleeping within hearing distance of her breathing. They remained like that, hands on each other, the garden surrounding them, no observers documenting or measuring. Just this moment outside protocol, outside formal structure, where their bodies communicated in languages neither fully understood but both clearly felt. Marcus started waking to his own grief. Not every night, but often enough that the pattern became undeniable. He would surface from dreams, fragments of earth, faces he'd known, places that no longer existed, and find his face wet, his breathing ragged, his body trying to expel what couldn't be physically removed. He tried to contain it, pressed his forearm against his mouth to muffle the sounds, turned toward the wall, away from the open doorway. But the chambers were too small, the silence too complete. Everything carried. The first few times Lyrasath didn't respond. Or if she did, he couldn't detect it. But on the fourth night of interrupted sleep, he heard movement from her chamber, the soft sound of her rising, footsteps approaching. She appeared in the doorway, stood there in the dim light from the stars, her bioluminescence patterns muted for night cycle. She didn't enter, the boundary remained, but she didn't leave either. He sat up slowly, wiping his face with the back of his hand, trying to compose himself. She made a sound, questioning or concerned, he couldn't determine. He shook his head, attempting to communicate that he was fine, that she should return to her rest, that his private breakdowns were his own problem. She didn't move, simply stood there, her presence steady and constant. After several minutes, she lowered herself to sit in the doorway itself, her back against the frame, her body positioned so she faced into her own chamber, but her presence remained at the threshold of his. She stayed there. Marcus lay back down, his breathing gradually settling, his body exhausted from the emotional surge. He could see her silhouette in the doorway, could hear her respiratory clicks, could feel the small comfort of not being entirely alone with his grief. He woke hours later to find her gone, returned to her own sleeping platform. But the next night when it happened again, and it did happen again, the dreams relentless, his body's attempts to process impossible loss manifesting in these nocturnal collapses, she returned to the doorway, sat in the same position, remained through the worst of it. It became another ritual. On the nights when he couldn't contain his grief, she would come to the threshold, never entering, never speaking, just present, her respiratory clicks mixing with his ragged breathing, her luminescence patterns dim but visible, providing just enough light that the darkness felt less absolute. Some nights he would talk, fragments only, trying to explain concepts she likely couldn't understand. The feeling of grass, the smell of rain on pavement, his sister's laugh, the way coffee tasted on cold mornings. Earth things, human things, things that existed only in his memory now, preserved in neural pathways that would deteriorate eventually, leaving him with nothing except the knowledge that he'd once belonged somewhere and to someone. Lyrasath never responded with words, but sometimes her luminescence patterns would shift in ways that felt like acknowledgement. Sometimes she would make that low resonant sound, the one he'd started interpreting as approval or comfort or acceptance. One particularly difficult night, after he'd exhausted himself with grief he couldn't name, he woke to find something in his chamber that hadn't been there before. A small, crystalline object sitting on the ledge beside his sleeping platform. It caught the starlight and refracted it, creating small patterns across the ceiling. He picked it up carefully. The crystal was warm, smooth, its interior holding swirls of color that shifted when he turned it. Not functional, not utilitarian. Simply beautiful. A gift, perhaps, or acknowledgement. Something that said, "I witnessed your pain and cannot fix it, but I can offer this small thing." He kept it, placed it where he could see it when he woke. The grief didn't stop, couldn't stop, had nowhere to go except through him until it wore itself out. But the crystal remained, and so did Lyraseth's presence in the doorway on difficult nights, and somehow both made the darkness slightly less consuming. The contact sessions had progressed beyond shoulders and backs. Lyraseth's hands now mapped territory that required his explicit stillness, the sides of his neck, the sensitive skin below his ribs, the inner surfaces of his arms where veins traced blue beneath pale skin. Her touch remained clinical in execution, but his body's responses had become impossible to disguise. His breathing would change when her fingers traced certain areas. His skin temperature would spike. Small sounds would escape his control, soft exhalations, barely audible catches in his throat. The observer documented everything, their notations creating a constant background soundtrack to these sessions that should have made them impersonal, but somehow didn't. When his turn came to reciprocate, his hands knew her body's geography now, the specific pressure that made her luminescence patterns flare, the precise location below her sternum, where her secondary respiratory system engaged, the soft tissue at the base of her skull that made her entire body tense when touched, her breathing stopping completely for several seconds before resuming in deeper patterns. They'd stopped maintaining distance between touches. His hands would remain on her body while she repositioned for his next area of exploration. Her palms would stay against his skin while she circled to access new territory. The accumulated contact became continuous rather than interrupted, their bodies in constant connection throughout the sessions. The night they crossed into new territory, she positioned his hands on her sides, just below her ribs, then guided them upward slowly, her own hands over his, directing the pressure and path. His fingertips moved across the transition between armor plating and softer tissue, following the geometric patterns higher than they'd previously explored. His breathing had gone shallow. His entire body was hyper-aware of the contact, of the heat radiating from her skin, of the way her bioluminescence patterns were cycling rapidly through colors he'd never seen before, deep purples and golds, brightness that illuminated the entire chamber. She made that low sound, but different now, longer, resonant in a way that he felt as much as heard. His hands paused, uncertain if he should continue, but she pressed her own hands against his, maintaining the contact, encouraging continuation. When his fingertips reached the upper chest area where her armor plating formed its most intricate patterns, she inhaled sharply. Her eyes met his, those endless black expanses that reflected nothing but somehow conveyed everything. Her hands slid from his wrists to his forearms, gripping gently, holding him in position. They remained frozen like that, his hands on her body, hers gripping his arms, the space between their faces contracting from 2 feet to 18 inches to 12. Her breath against his face was warm and carried that sweet metallic scent he'd noticed since revival. His own breathing had synced to hers, deep inhalations, held pauses, slow releases. The observer made a notation sound, urgent and sharp, different from the usual clinical documentation. Lyraseth's eyes didn't leave his, but she made a sound in response. Acknowledgement or dismissal, he couldn't tell. The observer spoke again, longer this time, tone carrying insistence. Lyraseth's hands released his arms. She stepped back, creating distance, her luminescence patterns dimming slightly. The session ended there, abrupt and incomplete, leaving his body thrumming with unresolved tension, his skin too warm, his breathing too fast. They walked back toward their chambers in silence, the guards maintaining their usual distance. But at the doorway between their rooms, Lyraseth paused, turned toward him. Her hand rose and settled against his face, palm cupping his jaw, her thumb tracing his cheekbone. The contact lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then she withdrew into her chamber, and he stood in his own doorway watching her silhouette move through her space, preparing for rest, her luminescence patterns still cycling through those unusual colors he'd never seen before tonight. He didn't sleep, lay on his platform feeling his heartbeat gradually slow, his skin temperature normalize, his body attempting to process information that bypassed language or conscious understanding. Something had shifted. Some boundary had been tested or crossed or recognized, and neither of them had pulled away. Marcus had never been presented to the court formally, had only glimpsed the palace's public spaces through corridor windows during his escorted movements between training, medical facilities, and his chambers. But on what he calculated as roughly his 45th day, guards arrived with different instructions. He was to be prepared for court presentation. They brought formal clothing, garments that approximated his body structure, but were clearly Viridian in design. Dark fabric that held iridescent qualities, similar to Lyrasith's skin, cut to emphasize the shoulders and chest in ways that made him uncomfortable, like being packaged for display. When he objected, the guards simply waited, their posture making clear that objection was noted and irrelevant. The court chamber was vast, its ceiling disappearing into darkness above, its walls lined with elevated platforms where Viridian nobility observed proceedings. The architecture created natural amplification, every sound carried, every movement visible from multiple angles. At the chamber's center, an elevated dais supported what could only be a throne, organic in design, appearing grown rather than constructed, shaped to fit Lyrasith's specific physiology. She sat there now, dressed in formal regalia that incorporated living elements into its structure, bioluminescent organisms that created shifting light patterns across the fabric, gems or crystals that pulsed in rhythm with her respiratory systems. She looked simultaneously familiar and completely alien, the queen rather than the person who sat in his doorway on difficult nights or corrected his combat form during training sessions. The guards positioned Marcus at the base of the dais. Every noble in the chamber was watching. He could feel the weight of their attention, their assessment, judgment being passed in languages and frameworks he couldn't access. Lyrasith spoke, her voice formal and carrying, the rhythmic language he still couldn't understand flowing in structured patterns that suggested ritual or proclamation. Other voices responded. Questions, he thought, or challenges. The exchange continued for several minutes, tension building in the chamber with each verbal volley. Then Lyrasith gestured, and a physician stepped forward, the same four-armed being who had observed their contact sessions. They spoke at length, presenting what must have been data, evidence, documentation of the process Marcus had been subjected to since revival. Holographic displays materialized, showing bioscan results, biochemical analyses, graphs tracking variables he couldn't interpret. The nobles reacted with sounds that clearly conveyed skepticism or concern. Several spoke at once, their voices overlapping, the chamber's acoustics turning the exchange cacophonous. Lyrasith's luminescence patterns shifted toward aggressive colors. Deep reds and oranges he'd learned meant anger or challenge. The formal exchange deteriorated into something closer to argument. Marcus stood motionless at the dais base, understanding nothing except that he was the subject of dispute, that his existence or status or purpose was being contested by forces completely outside his control or comprehension. One noble in particular, wearing regalia that suggested high status, seemed focused on Marcus directly. They descended from their elevated platform, approaching until they stood perhaps 10 feet away, their body language radiating hostility or possessiveness. They gestured toward Marcus while addressing Lyrasith, their tone accusatory. Lyrasith responded sharply, her own body language shifting into something Marcus had only seen during advanced combat training. Threat display. Warning. Her luminescence patterns were bright enough now to cast shadows across the chamber, her full height emphasized by posture that made her appear larger, more dangerous. The noble didn't retreat. Instead, they took another step toward Marcus, their hand rising as though to touch him, to claim or examine or make some point about ownership or access. Lyrasith moved faster than Marcus had ever seen her move outside combat. One moment on the throne, the next positioned between Marcus and the noble, her body a physical barrier, a low sound emerging from her that made his hindbrain scream danger. The chamber went silent, every noble motionless. The threat display unmistakable to everyone present, crossing whatever cultural boundaries existed. She would defend this human, this last remnant of an extinct species, with physical force if necessary. The noble backed away slowly, returned to their elevated platform. The formal session concluded shortly after, Lyrasith speaking final words in tones that brooked no argument, her body remaining between Marcus and the assembled court, until the guards escorted him from the chamber. Lyrathis didn't return to her chambers that night. Marcus waited, listening through the open doorway, hearing only silence from her space. The palace sounds around him carried tension, distant voices, movement in corridors that usually remained quiet during rest cycles, the sense of crisis or confrontation continuing beyond the court presentation. He sat by his viewing screen, watching the binary stars, his body still processing the adrenaline surge from being displayed and disputed, from witnessing Lyrathis' threat display, from understanding at a visceral level just how precarious his status remained. Valuable enough to fight over, important enough to present, but still property in every legal and practical sense, still subject to forces that saw him as specimen rather than person. She finally appeared in the doorway, near what he'd learned to recognize as dawn, the lighter star of the binary system beginning to dominate their shared illumination. She looked exhausted, her luminescence patterns dim, her body language carrying defeat or resignation he'd never seen before. She didn't sit in her usual doorway position. Instead, she stood there, her eyes on him, and he saw something in her expression that transcended their usual careful distance, apology perhaps, or recognition of the position she'd placed him in. Regret or acknowledgement that whatever was building between them came with costs neither had adequately calculated. He stood and moved toward the doorway, stopped just inside his own chamber, maintaining the boundary she'd established, but closing the distance as much as protocol allowed. Her eyes tracked his movement, her breathing shallow and fast. Emotional distress or physical exhaustion, both maybe. He extended his hand toward her, not quite reaching across the threshold but offering invitation or support or acknowledgement of shared burden. She looked at his hand for several seconds. Then her own hand rose, reaching across the boundary she'd never previously crossed. Their fingertips touched first, careful, testing. Then her palm slid against his, fingers interlacing, creating the first true hand-holding they'd shared outside the formal contact sessions. Her skin was cool now, the heat that usually radiated from her diminished by whatever she'd endured in court negotiations. Her grip was tight, almost desperate, her body remaining in her chamber, while their joined hands spanned the threshold between them. They stood like that while the lighter star brightened, while the palace sounds shifted from night cycle to day cycle, while whatever crisis had followed the court presentation continued beyond their hearing. Just their hands clasped across the doorway, bodies separated by protocol, connection maintained despite every force trying to define them in categories that allowed no space for what they'd actually become. When she finally pulled away, her eyes remained on his. She made that low sound, approval or acknowledgement or promise. Then she withdrew into her chamber, and he heard her settle onto her sleeping platform, her respiratory clicks eventually slowing into rest patterns. He didn't sleep, sat in his doorway with his back against the frame, positioned where she usually sat on difficult nights, maintaining watch over her rest, the way she'd maintained presence through his grief. The crystal she'd given him caught the dawn light, refracting it across his chamber walls in patterns that shifted with the changing illumination. Small things, small rituals and gestures and moments of connection built across 45 days of proximity and protocol and the gradual dissolution of boundaries neither had chosen, but both continued navigating. Not enough to change his status, not sufficient to grant him agency or choice about his own future, but enough to make clear that something existed between them that transcended biology, politics, the clinical documentation of compatible physiologies. Enough that when the guards arrived later that day with instructions for the third phase preparation, Marcus's first response was neither fear nor resignation, but the question of what this choice, if it could be called choice, would mean for her. The ritual chamber was deeper in the palace than Marcus had previously traveled. The journey there took over an hour, moving through sections where the architecture became older, more organic, walls that pulsed with bioluminescence, floors that felt alive beneath his feet. The guards maintained complete silence, their body language suggesting reverence or apprehension about the location itself. The chamber was circular, its walls smooth and dark, covered in what looked like living tissue, membranes that shifted subtly with respiration, creating the impression of being inside something's body rather than a constructed space. At the center, a platform that resembled the sleeping structures but larger, designed for 2 occupants, its surface already responding to ambient body heat by creating subtle depressions for optimal contact. Environmental controls lined the walls, systems designed to support both human and viridian physiology simultaneously, monitoring everything from oxygen content to pheromone concentrations to electromagnetic fields. Marcus had no framework to detect. Observation panels were built into the walls, but the physicians had assured them through translators that documentation would be minimal during the actual integration phase. This was sacred space, they explained, where biology transcended politics, and whatever occurred was between partners rather than subjects and observers. Marcus stood beside the platform, wearing minimal clothing. The protocol required maximum skin contact for the integration process to succeed. Lyraseth entered from the opposite side, similarly dressed, her body's natural armor plating more visible now without the usual formal garments. Her luminescence patterns were muted, cycling through uncertain colors. Blues and greens that he'd learned signaled anxiety or reservation. They'd been instructed that once they committed to the platform, they couldn't separate for 48 hours without risking permanent damage to both their physiologies. The integration required sustained contact, continuous biochemical exchange, their bodies learning to function as a single system rather than 2 independent organisms. If they stopped mid-process, the incomplete merger could corrupt their individual biological systems irreparably. 48 hours, 2 full rotations of the binary stars, enough time for his body to bind itself to hers at cellular levels that would persist regardless of what happened afterward, regardless of whether he remained her consort or became something else, discarded, reassigned, whatever fate the court decided for a human who'd served his biological function. Lyraseth moved around the platform until she stood facing him, perhaps 6 feet of space between them. Her eyes were on his, her breathing controlled but shallow. He could see the tension in her body. This was no more freely chosen for her than for him. Her biology demanded this, her dynasty's survival required it, but the cost of forcing it, of proceeding without genuine consent, weighed visibly in her posture. "I need you to understand," Marcus said, speaking human language she likely couldn't comprehend, but needing to voice it anyway, "that I don't blame you for my circumstances. You didn't make me the last human. You didn't destroy my world or steal 3,000 years from me. You're working within systems neither of us controls." She made a sound, questioning or responding, he couldn't tell, but her body language shifted slightly, some tension releasing. "But I also need you to understand that if we do this, it can't just be because your court demands it, or because biology doesn't give us alternatives. There has to be something real, something that's ours rather than theirs." He moved toward the platform, sat on its edge, feeling it adjust immediately to his body temperature and weight. Looked up at her, this alien queen who'd sat in his doorway during grief, who'd taught him combat forms during dawn sessions, who'd given him a crystal when words failed, who'd physically positioned herself between him and a hostile court. "I'm still choosing this," he said quietly. "It's not a free choice, but it's not forced either. Whatever we're building, I want to keep building it. I want to know what we might become if we actually get the chance." Lyraseth remained motionless for several seconds. Then she moved to the platform, lowering herself to sit beside him, their bodies not yet touching but close enough that he could feel her heat, smell her scent, sense her presence in all the ways he'd learned over 45 days of proximity. Her hand rose, settled against his face, palm warm against his cheek, thumb tracing his jaw exactly the way she had the night everything shifted in the bathing chamber. Then she leaned forward, and her forehead touched his. The first time their faces had made direct contact, her eyes were impossibly close, those black expanses that had frightened him initially, but now simply felt like hers, like Lyraseth, like this specific being whose breathing he could track in his sleep. They remained like that, foreheads touching, breathing synchronized, the ritual chamber's environmental systems already adjusting to their combined presence. Then she shifted, moving to lie on the platform, and he followed, their bodies finding positions instinctively, his back to her chest, her arm across his waist, her breath against his shoulder, every point of contact generating heat and chemical exchange, and the beginning of whatever transformation this integration would trigger. The lights dimmed. The environmental systems engaged fully. His body began responding to proximity and pheromones and sustained contact, his heart rate slowing, his breathing deepening, his awareness narrowing to just this: her body against his, her warmth surrounding him, her presence constant and close and chosen as much as anything in their impossible circumstances could be chosen. Time dissolved during the integration phase. Marcus's consciousness drifted between states that felt like sleep and waking, and something else entirely, dreamlike awareness, where his body's boundaries became uncertain, where he couldn't distinguish his heartbeat from hers, his breathing from the rhythm of her respiratory systems. The sustained contact created sensations he had no framework to process. His skin, where it pressed against hers, felt hypersensitive, every small shift in pressure or temperature registering with impossible clarity. He could feel her biochemistry working beneath her skin, systems he couldn't name doing things he couldn't understand, but somehow his body recognized and responded to, adjusting his own processes to complement hers. They moved together without conscious coordination, shifting positions as their bodies required, sometimes facing each other, his arms around her while she held him with strength that should have felt restraining but somehow translated to security, sometimes spooned with her behind him, her larger frame curving around his, her breath against his neck creating small shivers that cascaded down his spine, sometimes lying side by side, hands clasped between them, legs tangled, every available surface in contact. The platform beneath them adjusted continuously, supporting their combined weight, regulating temperature, doing something with embedded technology that seemed designed to facilitate the integration. Marcus could feel it working: subtle vibrations, electromagnetic pulses, chemical releases into the air they breathed that made his thoughts drift and his body relax into the process. Liraseth's luminescence patterns became a constant light source, brightening and dimming in cycles that seemed connected to whatever was occurring inside her body. During bright phases, the entire chamber would illuminate, revealing the membrane walls contracting and expanding like lungs, the living architecture, participating in their transformation. During dim phases, they'd exist in near darkness, only the faint light from her bioluminescence to show her face close to his, her eyes open or closed. He couldn't tell which anymore, those black expanses revealing nothing but somehow communicating everything. He lost track of how many times they'd repositioned, how many times his body had reached some threshold and needed to move, to adjust, to find new contact points. Liraseth guided him through these transitions with touch, her hands on his shoulders, his waist, directing him into positions that served the process. Sometimes he initiated the movements, responding to instincts he didn't consciously understand, and she would follow, her body accommodating his needs with the same natural ease. The integration wasn't painless. At intervals, sharp sensations would spike through his nervous system, his body registering that something fundamental was changing, that his biochemistry was being altered in ways that transcended normal human parameters. During these episodes, Liraseth would hold him tighter, make those low-resonant sounds directly against his skin, her body providing anchor while his systems adjusted. He noticed changes as they occurred, his sense of smell heightening until he could distinguish individual components in Liraseth's scent. The sweet metallic base, yes, but also deeper layers that carried emotional states, arousal, the pheromone signals that his body now responded to automatically. His temperature regulation shifting, his skin staying warmer than human normal even during rest phases. His hearing expanding to detect frequencies he'd previously missed. The environmental system's operations, the membrane wall's rhythmic contractions, sounds from Liraseth's body that painted a complete picture of her physiological state. Most significantly, awareness. Not telepathy or mind reading, but something more physical. The ability to sense her location, her physical state, her well-being through channels that bypassed conscious thought. When she was tense, he felt it as tension in his own body. When she relaxed, he experienced parallel relaxation. When her body moved toward arousal, which it did, repeatedly, her systems responding to sustained intimacy in ways the clinical sessions had never triggered, he felt it as his own desire, impossible to separate their responses from each other. They hadn't spoken since entering the chamber. Language remained unnecessary or inadequate. But Liraseth made sounds throughout. Her approval tones, small clicks, variations in her breathing that conveyed meaning his body understood, even if his mind couldn't process the specific information. He responded with his own sounds, human vocalizations that felt primitive but effective, his voice creating vibrations against her skin during the positions when his face pressed to her chest or shoulder or neck. The closest thing to conversation occurred during what must have been the integration's peak, both their bodies simultaneously reaching some biological threshold, systems aligning in ways that generated cascading responses. Lyrasith's entire body tensed, her luminescence flaring to brightness that should have been blinding, her hands gripping him with pressure that left marks. Marcus's own body responded with equivalent intensity, his back arching, his breathing stopping completely for several seconds, while every nerve fired simultaneously. Through it, her voice, making sounds that weren't words but carried unmistakable meaning, recognition, acceptance, relief or joy or satisfaction or all of those things together, his own voice answering without conscious decision, sounds that meant yes and here and together, and we succeeded. The peak passed. Their bodies relaxed incrementally, the intensity fading but leaving behind permanent changes, permanent connections. Lyrasith's hands on his face, her forehead against his, both breathing hard, their hearts beating in the complementary rhythm they'd developed over weeks of proximity training, but now perfected, made permanent. They held each other through the integration's final phases, the process completing itself, while they drifted in and out of consciousness, their bodies handling what their minds couldn't actively manage. When Marcus surfaced to fuller awareness, he found them lying face to face, Lyrasith's eyes open and on his, her hand resting over his heart feeling its beat, his own hand positioned similarly over where her primary cardiovascular system worked beneath her chest armor. Bound. The word arrived in his mind without quite being thought, not enslaved or owned, but connected at levels that transcended choice or circumstance. Her biology was part of his now. His was part of hers. Whatever happened moving forward, that fundamental fact would persist. The chamber's lights gradually brightened, signaling the integration's completion. 48 hours passed, 2 rotations of the binary stars. His body permanently altered, his biochemistry merged with hers, his future bound to whatever purposes she served or suffered. But her forehead remained against his, her hand steady over his heart, and through their bond, because it was a bond now, undeniable, he felt what she felt. Not words or thoughts, but emotional states, relief, satisfaction, something that approximated joy or hope, and underneath everything else, threaded through it all, commitment. Whatever they'd built over 45 days of protocol and proximity, whatever had grown between them, despite every force trying to define their connection in purely biological terms, she intended to protect it, to protect him. Whatever power she possessed, she would use to ensure he remained more than specimen, more than catalyst, more than the last human serving Viridian purposes. The court's response to the integration's success was immediate and complicated. Lyrasith's capacity for producing heirs had been verified. The physician's scans confirmed the metamorphic changes in her biology that would now allow succession. The dynasty was secured, the political crisis averted, but Marcus's status remained contested. Some noble factions argued he should be transferred to research facilities, now that his primary function was complete. Others insisted he represented too valuable a genetic resource to be managed by a single party, even a queen. Still others suggested he should be granted formal status as consort, protected by legal frameworks that would prevent his commodification. Marcus heard none of these debates directly. He remained in the residential wing, in his chambers that connected to Lyrasith's, through that eternally open door. But he felt the tension in her body when she returned from court sessions, saw it in her luminescence patterns, sensed it through their bond, the constant negotiation, the careful political maneuvering required to maintain any space at all where they could simply exist together, rather than being defined entirely by others' purposes. The integration had changed his body in more ways than the physicians had explained or perhaps anticipated. He needed less sleep now. His metabolism had shifted to something between human and Viridian, accepting both food types, processing nutrients more efficiently. His temperature regulation operated differently, his body preferring the warmer environments Narration favored. Most significantly, separation became physically uncomfortable. Being too far from her for too long generated a low-level distress in his system, like chronic pain or persistent illness that only proximity would resolve. She experienced parallel effects. On days when court obligations required extended separation, she would return to their chambers with visible tension, her luminescence patterns agitated, her movements short and controlled. The moment she entered, his body would respond, relief cascading through systems he couldn't name, the distress evaporating, his breathing deepening. She would come to the doorway or cross into his chamber. That boundary was gone now, dissolved along with so many others during the integration, and they would simply be close. Her hand on his shoulder, his palm against her back, proximity reasserting itself after absence. They fell into new rhythms, morning training sessions where their bodies now moved with unprecedented synchronization, their bond allowing them to anticipate each other's movements without conscious thought. Evening sessions where they would sit in the garden, Narration teaching him the names and properties of various plants in her own language, patiently repeating until his pronunciation approximated accuracy. Nights where they shared her sleeping platform, the one in his chamber abandoned, their bodies requiring sustained contact even during rest. The crystal he'd placed on his viewing ledge was joined by other objects, a plant cutting from the garden that somehow survived in his chamber's environment, a piece of fabric from training sessions that carried her scent, small accumulations that marked the space as actually his, rather than generic quarters for unspecified guests. Narration began teaching him her language with focused intent, not the full formal structure, that would take years, but functional communication. Essential verbs and nouns, ways to express basic needs and desires, the words for yes and no and help and stay and go. She would speak, then wait for his repetition, correcting pronunciation with gentle touches to his jaw or throat, adjusting how he shaped sounds. He learned slowly but steadily, motivated by the desire to actually communicate rather than rely entirely on translation technology or physical intuition. One evening, sitting in the garden with her body warm against his side, he managed a complete sentence in her language, simple and probably grammatically incorrect, but comprehensible. "I am glad we did this." Her luminescence patterns flared bright. She turned to face him fully, her hands framing his face, her eyes on his with intensity that made his breath catch. "I'm also glad," she responded in his language, the words carefully shaped but unmistakable. "You are mine. I am yours. This is not what others intended, but it is what exists." She'd been learning too, he realized, studying his language with the same focus she'd brought to teaching him hers, building bridges between them that transcended the bond, that allowed for chosen communication rather than just biological resonance. He leaned forward and kissed her. It was the first time. Their contact during integration had included every form of physical intimacy, except this specifically human gesture, this press of mouths that his body demanded, even though hers had no cultural framework for it. She startled slightly, then understood, her lips parting against his, her hands tightening on his face, her body responding with that instinctive recognition their bond facilitated. When they separated, she made a questioning sound, asking without words what that meant, what it signified in human context. "Affection," he said softly, combining human and Viridian words because he didn't know the full translation. Desire, connection, claiming and being claimed, all of those things. Her understanding rippled through their bond. Acceptance, pleasure, the intention to incorporate this gesture into their private vocabulary. She leaned forward and replicated it, her kiss slightly awkward, but unmistakably hers, unmistakably given rather than just received. 3 months after integration, the court reached a formal decision regarding Marcus's status. Narration returned from the final session, with luminescence patterns he'd learned meant triumph mixed with exhaustion, her body language carrying relief and residual tension. She came directly to find him in the training facility, where he'd been working through combat sequences while waiting, trying to occupy himself during her absence. The moment she entered, he felt it through their bond. Success, resolution, safety. She crossed the space between them, and pulled him into an embrace that lifted him off his feet, her strength casual and easy, her body radiating heat and satisfaction. When she set him down, her hands remained on his shoulders, her eyes on his. "Consort," she said in his language, her pronunciation careful. "Protected legal status. You are not property. You are not specimen. You are mine through choice and bond, and no one may challenge this." Relief made his knees weak. He leaned into her, his forehead against her shoulder, his arms around her waist, feeling the full reality of what she'd fought for and won settling into his understanding. Not freedom. He would never be free in the way he'd once understood the concept, never able to simply leave or choose independent paths. But recognition, status that acknowledged his personhood, legal protection that prevented the worst possibilities. "What did it cost?" he asked quietly, knowing court victories always carried prices. Her hand stroked through his hair, a gesture she'd learned from watching him, understanding its comfort value. Concessions. Some territories given to opposing factions, resources redirected, political debts accumulated. She paused, then added with weight, "Worth the cost." They remained like that, holding each other in the training facility, while the lighter star climbed toward its peak position and the palace continued its constant operations around them. Small moment, private victory. The beginning of whatever they would build together now that the immediate crisis had passed, and they could actually focus on existence rather than mere survival. Eventually, she pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "Show me that combat sequence you were practicing," she said with warmth. "Your balance was wrong." He laughed. Actual laughter. The first real joy he'd felt since revival. "My balance is perfect." "You just want to show off." "Yes," she agreed, her own expression shifting toward what he'd learned to recognize as her version of amusement. "I do want to show off. For you. To you. Because you notice and appreciate and challenge me to improve." They moved into the training patterns, their bodies synchronizing through bond and practice, and 3 months of learning each other's rhythms. Sparring light contact, testing techniques, her corrections gentle but precise, his counter moves increasingly confident as he learned her tells and exploited openings she left deliberately for him to discover. Between rounds they shared water, his container and hers, both drinking from each, the small ritual they'd established back during those first awkward training sessions, now imbued with everything that had happened since. His hand in hers, her thumb tracing patterns on his palm, their breathing elevated from exertion, their bodies warm and alive and together. "I want to show you something," Lyraseth said, after they'd cooled down sufficiently. She led him out of the training facility, through corridors he'd traveled dozens of times, but toward a section of the palace he hadn't previously accessed. They emerged onto an observation deck, open to the actual atmosphere rather than viewing through screens or panels. The binary stars dominated the sky, amber and pale blue, their combined light creating shadows with doubled edges across the palace grounds extending below. The wind carried scents from the planet's surface, organic and complex, fundamentally alien but no longer frightening. "This is where I come when I need to remember perspective," Lyraseth said quietly. "When court politics become overwhelming, when the weight of dynasty and succession and ruling becomes too much, I come here and look at the stars and remember that we are very small, and most of what seems critical now will not matter in 100 years. Marcus stood beside her, their arms touching, their bond thrumming with shared presence. He looked up at the binary stars, at those alien lights that would never be soul, but had become his sky anyway. Thought about Earth, about everyone he'd lost, about the future he'd imagined that would never exist. The grief remained, would always remain, but it had become something he could carry, rather than something that crushed him. "What will matter?" he asked. 100 years from now?" Lyraseth's hand found his, their fingers interlacing with practiced ease. "That we chose each other," she said simply. "That when we could have been only what they made us, biological functions serving political necessity, we became something else. Partners, companions, individuals who recognized each other across species boundaries and impossible circumstances, and chose connection over isolation." She turned to face him fully, her free hand rising to his face, her touch warm and familiar. "Your people are gone. I cannot return them to you. My situation is complicated, and will remain complicated. I cannot give you the freedom you might have had in another life, but I can give you this, a place where you belong, recognition of who you are beyond what you represent, the promise that you will never again face existence alone. Marcus leaned into her touch, his eyes meeting hers, those black expanses that had once terrified him now simply her eyes, Lyrasith's eyes, belonging to this specific being who'd sat in doorways during his grief, who'd defended him before her court, who'd bound herself to him as irrevocably as he was bound to her. "That's enough," he said quietly. "It's not what I would have chosen if choice had been truly free. But it's real. It's ours. And it's enough." She pulled him closer and he went willingly, his arms around her waist, hers around his shoulders, their bodies fitting together with the ease of 3 months of practice and adjustment. They stood like that on the observation deck while the binary stars climbed higher, while the palace continued its operations below, while the galaxy turned on indifferent to their small transformation. The last human, bound to an alien queen. Not a story he would have written for himself, not a future he could have imagined during those desperate hours in revival when he'd woken to find his entire world gone. But it was his story now, and hers, and they would write its continuation together, in whatever language they could manage across whatever boundaries remained, for whatever time they were given. Below in his chamber, the crystal she'd given him would be catching starlight, refracting it into patterns across the walls. A small beauty, small gift offered during darkness, the beginning of everything they'd built and would continue building, not because they had to, not because biology demanded it, not because courts required it, but because they chose it. Because across impossible distances and profound differences, they'd recognized each other and decided that recognition mattered more than all the forces trying to define them otherwise. Enough. It was enough. It would be enough.